Hello, I'm Jeremy Fernandez and welcome to this special program on ABC News 24 in conjunction with OurSay.org. OurSay is a web-based advocacy group aiming to revitalise public participation in politics. During the past 3 weeks, OurSay and ABC News 24 have invited people to post their most pressing foreign policy questions. And tonight, the Minister for Foreign Affairs Bob Carr responds to 4 questions that received the most votes on the web. We're live on ABC News 24 this evening and at OurSay.org and simulcast on ABC News Radio. We're also broadcasting throughout the Asia Pacific on Australia Network and Radio Australia. Senator Bob Carr, welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be with you.
Let's begin in the Asia Pacific region. More than 500 people have voted for this question from Emilia Colucci.
Australia has strengthened its ties with the greater Asia-Pacific region through hard power approaches, such as growth in military capabilities, trading and so on. Another crucial aspect of improving ties with our neighbouring countries is to increase intercultural communication and understanding. The arts provide a channel of cultural exchange and has the potential of increasing public awareness and understanding about important issues affecting other communities and populations. However, there seems to be a lack of focus on this area on a federal level. Receiving government funding in the arena of arts and culture is a challenge, particularly for smaller events and organizations. Soft power approaches do not seem to be at the forefront of strengthening foreign affiliations. As a director of Aperture Festival, an international ethnographic documentary festival that aims to support and promote Asia-Pacific cultures, I am particularly interested in this question. What is the Australian government agenda to strengthen ties with the greater Asia-Pacific, also to the arts and intercultural exchanges? Thank you.
Emilia Colucci there. Bob Carr, this idea of soft power and the lack of people-to-people relations between Australia and its near neighbours in the region was a big feature of the White Paper on the Asian Century.
Yes, it was, and I'm a great believer in what I'd call cultural diplomacy. And the people-to-people contacts are the most crucial part of so many of our relationships. The White Paper did identify it, and if you'd pardon me making reference to notes here, we announced in the White Paper that we'll coordinate an Australian presence at major arts events such as the Korean International Art Fair and assist organisations like Asia Link, promoting collaboration between Australian and Asian artists. We encourage the arts community, arts institutions, including those in regional Australia, to look to Asia. We've got a formal agreement, this is one example, a formal agreement on cultural cooperation between Australia and China. And the Year of Australian Culture in China, Imagine Australia, it's called, together with its counterpart program, Experience China, is the biggest bilateral cultural exchange program ever between the two countries. I believe in this, but I believe the question goads us to think about doing more. But if I can just mention by way of a practical example, when I was in Vanuatu inspecting Australian aid programs, I went to some work being funded by Australia for disability support. And there in Port Vila, I saw a very powerful theatre performance by actors with disabilities. And it took a message to the people of Vanuatu about disabilities. It did 2 things. It captured the creativity of this community and it shifted thinking about the role of people with disabilities in a small island developing state.
As Foreign Minister, you would have encountered many traces of the post-colonial hurt that still exists in many parts of the region. Over the years, and particularly in your years as a politician, have you seen that change? And how have you seen it change in terms of Australia's pushing its kind of cultural palatability, I guess, to the rest of the region?
I think we've got to be sensitive, but the way to build bridges, I think, is Australia is a creative middle power. And I think highlighting our creativity is a way of getting over those gaps. As we approach, I guess, the Melanesian world, we've got to be conscious of the legacy that lies behind us. When we're in Asia, we've got to be somewhat conscious that within a lifetime behind us, there was something that was embraced and emblazoned as the White Australia policy.
In terms of the arts of Australia in the region and vice versa. How much is that an issue of just organising, and how much of that is dependent on funding, and where is that money going to come from? Is it going to be redirected from existing arts funding that exists in Australia, disability arts, regional arts?
Well, it'll be a mix of both. It'll be a mix of both. And I said a moment ago that we want to encourage arts institutions to think about projection in Asia. What I've noticed in Hong Kong and Singapore is the building of arts entertainment venues. Indeed, there's an Australian recruited to coordinate it in West Kowloon in Hong Kong. Michael Lynch, former executive director of the Opera House Trust. And this is going to provide opportunities for performing arts companies, and it's going to provide exhibition space for Australian painting and sculpture.
And are these measures part of the foreign aid budget, or are they separate?
No, they're separate. But they're linkages between existing arts organisations and their counterparts in Asia, very largely. Where they're related to poverty alleviation, they can be easily linked to OurSay.
All right, let's go on to our next video question from the Foreign Minister. This one is from Robin Connell, and it attracted more than 1,000 votes. It's read here by Robin's daughter, Rosie Forsyth. Well, we don't have that tape, unfortunately. I'm going to read out that question. Robin Connell writes, why have you so clearly abandoned advocacy for Australian publisher Julian Assange in the light of evidence of a secret grand jury in the USA? He's internationally respected, she says, awarded multiple human rights awards, standing for the Australian Senate, and yet the silence from the Australian government is deafening. It appears as though policy on this has been dictated by the USA. That question from Robin Connell. Bob Carr, you and the government have left little doubt about what you think about Julian Assange.
Well, hold on. There's a major inaccuracy in this. There's one legal action against Julian Assange, and it comes from the Swedish government. It's got nothing to do with Australia. We've got no standing in it. We've got no capacity to walk into a court in London, let alone the Ecuadorian embassy, and haul Julian Assange out. There were 600 Australians arrested overseas last year, and they're entitled to the same support that he's getting. He faces accusations of sexual assault in Sweden. The Swedish government, the Swedish prosecutor, has won in the courts of England his extradition to Sweden. Now we've got precisely no standing in that. If we'd walked into a court in London and said, we're here to take sides in this matter, the judge would have shown us the door. We have precisely no standing. This is the only legal action against Julian Assange, and I might say he's received more consular support than any Australian we know of in a comparable period.
How much merit do you place on these suspicions that a secret grand jury has already issued an indictment for Julian Assange?
Well, there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of that. We've indicated through our embassy in Washington, and when I spoke to a senior American, that we want to be kept informed of that. But the Americans have announced no intentions in respect of Julian Assange.
Do you think they tell you that anyway, though?
So we're left with a position where he faces one legal constraint, and that is one brought in the English courts successfully by the prosecutor of Sweden. Now, what is Mr. Assange suggesting we should do? We've got no standing in that court case, and the idea that the Swedes are seeking to extradite him as a front for American action is absurd, because at any time in the last 2.5 years, I think 3 years now, 4 years now, the Americans could have sought his extradition from the UK. They didn't do that. And in any case, the Americans could only succeed in extraditing him from Sweden with the permission not only of the Swedish government, but of the British government. And both governments, both that of Britain and that of Sweden, have said they don't allow extradition in any case that might involve capital punishment.
And does that reflect the representations you've made to the Swedish government, to the UK government, to the US government?
We've made representations to the Swedish government that should they, in their handlings of Mr. Assange, they respect due process, which means he would be treated, he'd be allowed all the rights of a citizen, that a citizen of Sweden would in a comparable situation. Now, that's what we do for any Australian. Any of the 600 Australians arrested around the world in the last year would get that level of representation. It's called consular representation, and we don't fight their cases in court. So this question of why don't we advocate for him, for goodness sake, what role is there for Australia to advocate for someone who faces allegations from Sweden of sexual assault and the prosecutor of Sweden, in this case, has experienced a victory in the London courts for his extradition? Australia's got no standing in that.
Why don't you believe Julian Assange should be treated and classified as a journalist? That's certainly one of the defences.
No, we haven't been asked to do that. We've got no role of classifying him.
How do you feel about that?
Well, hold on. We're not involved in any court case here. There is no court case pending other than that from Sweden about sexual assault, in which case, whether he works as a journalist or a house painter or a horticulturalist, has no bearing whatsoever. He has been sought by Sweden. The Swedish prosecutor has won in the British courts. Australia has no standing. So this suggestion that somehow we should intervene to protect him must imply that we've got the capacity to land special forces on the roof of the Ecuadorian embassy in Knightsbridge and whisk him away.
There are some who suggest that the UK government could, if this drags on, deregister the Ecuadorian embassy in London and seize Assange. Would the Australian government support such a move? Is that something you see happening?
I'm sorry, but why would the British government do that?
Well, the fact that they're staking out the Ecuadorian embassy in the first place. Why would the
British government do that when they had Julian Assange roaming freely, available to them for, what was it, 4 years? 4 years? They're staking out the Ecuadorian embassy because he's defied a British court order by not presenting himself.
Is it your understanding that the grand jury has met in secret in the US?
No, there's no evidence of that whatsoever.
What guarantees have the Americans given you about Julian Assange's safety should he end up in Sweden somehow?
We've told them we want to be kept informed because he's an Australian citizen, but again, you're making an assumption there that the Swedes are seeking his extradition on behalf of the United States. Now, that is an absurdity. Sweden is a liberal democracy. The Swedish prosecutor is pursuing this as independent of the Swedish government, as a director of public prosecutions in any Australian state or in the Commonwealth would be independent of those Australian governments. And this process has won in the English courts. When Julian Assange resisted the extradition move in the English courts, he lost. And in defiance of British law, in defiance of the order of a British court, fled to the Ecuadorian embassy. Now, in this, again, Australia's got no standing or status, no capacity to influence this. Sweden is acting on its own. The idea that the Swedes would hand him over to Americans is contradicted by the fact that they don't hand over anyone in extradition where there is, one, the possibility of capital punishment, or two, the matter concerns defence or security.
Does the speculation, regardless of whether you believe there is evidence or not that the US intends to pursue Julian Assange, does the speculation around this and the rhetoric that's coming from US legislators concern you?
Well, no. Americans will respond as American law dictates. We've told the Americans he's an Australian citizen, we want to be kept informed. But again, there are 600 Australians arrested in the last year. They get consular support. He's had more than any one of them in the time that he's been in trouble. He's had Australians making representations to the Swedes about their intentions and seeking guarantees that he'll be treated as any Swedish citizen would, and we've received those guarantees.
Right, we'll have to shift our focus now to North Africa. Another one of the questions. This one received more than 1,000 votes, and it comes from Dean Leviton.
22 years in Sudan, roughly 2 million people have died and 4 million people displaced as a result of war and violence. The perpetrator, Omar al-Bashir, is still in power and now targets the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile region. With an important place on the UN Security Council, we have a unique opportunity to leave a powerful human rights legacy by driving an end to the violence in Sudan. Foreign Minister, how will Australia use its position on the UN Security Council to achieve a lasting, peaceful resolution in Sudan? Thank you.
Dean Leviton there, and I'll just mention that Dean Leviton works for a Jewish advocacy agency, Jewish Aid in Australia, and he feels an affinity with what's going on in Sudan. There are certainly big hopes, aren't there? That question just illustrates big hopes about Australia's performance on the Security Council.
Yeah, of course, and I think that's it's just tremendous that an Australian is taking an interest in what's happening in what might be regarded as a faraway country. The first thing is we've encouraged Sudan to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, and that would allow the ICC to properly investigate something that concerns this questioner, and that is the events that have occurred in Darfur, including President al-Bashir's role in alleged war crimes. We do that publicly, not only in the Security Council but in the UN Human Rights Council. We've been part of fortnightly discussions on the Security Council on the situation in Sudan and South Sudan, and in discussions of the 3 peacekeeping missions there. We take, I think, a balanced approach, critical of those who engage in violence or aggression, but commending the parties who show compromise in negotiations. We've also taken the opportunity of the UNSC seat to advocate improvements in how UN peacekeeping missions operate in the Sudan and South Sudan, and to advocate improvements in how the current sanctions regime works, including the arms embargo, which we think needs to address the humanitarian crisis in Darfur. We've continually expressed our concern over the attacks on peacekeepers there as well. Only last week, 7 were killed. We've also been active in council discussions on how the council can support the ICC in relation to its activities there. I'm sorry to read from the notes, but this is a report from our ambassador, Gary Quinlan, in the UN.
How do these concerns about the situation in Sudan stack up amid what may be regarded as more pressing concerns, things like Syria, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, North Korea, Iran? Where does Sudan fit into all of that?
Well, it figures very large. The humanitarian circumstances are extreme. The poverty is extreme. Southern Sudan is, I'm told, as big a land area as France. It has 100 kilometres of road. Communications is very difficult, and I think we're more acutely aware of the disaster in Syria because the refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon can be readily accessed, whereas a lot that happens in these 2 countries is out of sight of the world community. I might refer to another theme though, and that is we look to African leadership to implement lasting solutions here. In both East and West Africa in recent times you've had African nations, African regional organisations providing leadership, and that's very, very welcome.
Indeed, African votes were crucial in getting Australia over the line in winning that Security Council seat. Is there a feeling that Australia needs to give back by elevating the concerns of the continent at the Security Council? Well,
70 to 80% of the work in the Security Council is related to Africa, so it is a heavy workload. We're seen, I think it's fair to say, during the election and since, as being a voice and a perspective independent of that of Europe and independent of that of the United States. One reason African countries were comfortable about voting for us was that they looked at Australia and they said, no, we agree with you. You're not America and you're not Europe. You've got your own perspective and you're looking across the Indian Ocean and taking a deeper interest in the African world, in both the positive and the challenging.
The new US ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, has named that the situation in Sudan is among the priorities for the US at the UN. I suppose it adds weight and some comfort to you that cause is being taken up by one of the Permanent 5.
Yeah, indeed it is. And I don't detect any divisions among the Permanent 5 that would impede proper attention to these challenges. The sort of tensions that have produced the deadlock on Syria don't appear to apply here.
All right, let's go to our final question this evening. It brings us back to one of the most divisive issues in domestic politics today. This question received the largest number of votes, nearly 1,400. It comes from Sentharan Raj.
Foreign Minister Carr, You recently committed to ensuring that Australia's foreign policy approach would promote lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex human rights as a core part of it. Many asylum seekers come by boat to Australia fleeing homophobic persecution. Papua New Guinea criminalises homosexuality with prison sentences of up to 14 years. With Australia's new foreign policy commitment in mind, how can you justify sending such asylum seekers to a place where their life or liberty could be threatened by these laws?
A question from Sentha and Raj. Bob Carr, this government policy with PNG seems quite incongruous to your previous statements about making LGBTI issues a core part of Australia's foreign policy.
I think it's a good question. Let me deal with it this way. If we can end people smuggling activity, which is now spiked with about 40,000 a year, that's 20% of the Australian migrant intake, and it's far too high. We can take more humanitarian, we can take more refugees with a humanitarian claim, like those fleeing homophobic persecution. We can increase the intake. We can bring them to these shores. Our capacity to increase our humanitarian intake is limited by the fact that people smuggling activity is out of hand. And at 40,000 per annum, that's the annualised rate you get if you take the monthly arrivals over the last 3 or 4 months. At 40,000 per annum is, as I said, 20% of the Australian migrant intake. If we can bring that to a halt, that dangerous activity at sea to a halt, by the short, sharp shock of the regional resettlement arrangement, then we can take more people who are fleeing homophobic persecution and other forms of persecution. But if we allow our immigration program to be displaced, our regular migration program to be displaced by the intrusion of people smuggling, our capacity to do that is acutely limited. Now, I am concerned about the fact that you've got a different legal, what we would see as an outdated, grotesquely outdated legal position applying in PNG. I understand, and I know this is little comfort, that there have been few, if any, charges laid or persecutions made under laws prohibiting homosexual activity in PNG. But let me say quickly, I recognise such laws are in place and they conflict with contemporary Australian values. Through our aid program, we fund activities in Asia and the Pacific that provide some relief and support to isolated communities facing such persecution. For example, program for AIDS services, for health services, legal services for homosexual groups and others vulnerable. But the key question here is that if we, through the regional resettlement arrangement, can bring an end to all this dangerous activity driven entirely, 100% by people smuggling these days and growing too far, too fast, then we can take more. We can lift that annual humanitarian intake, including people fleeing homophobic persecution, from 20,000 to 27,000 per annum.
As you put it, this sharp shock is necessary to deal longer term with the people smuggling issue. But what happens to those people, those tens of thousands of people who are being sent to PNG Nauru? What happens to them?
Well, they're people who have attempted, through irregular immigration, paying $16,000 to a people smuggler, to take the place that would otherwise be there for people recognised by the UN as refugees in camps, and we've read about them in Indonesia, people not living in camps, who, Hazaras for example, who want to get here as part of that annual humanitarian intake. Now, as long as that dangerous, profit-driven, illegal activity by people, and people smuggling is illegal under our laws and under the laws of other countries in the region, as long as that goes on, we're constrained in our capacity to lift even further the world's most generous humanitarian or refugee intake. So I say to our questioner, we've got to bring under control this irregular immigration that is driven by people smuggling, and I've got to say candidly, if it can grow in a few months to 20,000 per annum, it can, and that's 40,000 per annum, which is 20% of the migrant intake. It could grow conceivably to 60,000 and further. Now, we cannot, that's why Kevin Rudd said we've got to respond with a short, sharp shock that kills the business model of people smuggling.
This issue has received a lot of coverage around the world. Does it embarrass you in any way to be explaining this to our regional partners?
That really, I don't want to be dismissive, that really is a myth. I mean, my conversations with foreign ministers, several in Europe, several in Asia about this matter, is a conversation with people who share the same problem. The European countries, those with impeccable liberal credentials, agree completely there ought to be a review of how the Refugee Convention works in progress. It works in practice. They've endorsed that initiative of the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. And when it comes to irregular migration, especially the spike in numbers out of Iran, both Malaysia and Indonesia have indicated by their own actions they're concerned. They're concerned at becoming transit countries for people being recruited by people smugglers to press on with that dangerous, that reckless journey to Australia.
Are we going to see more of these partnership deals arise, and to what degree are these LGBTI issues going to form a core part of those negotiations before those deals are set in stone?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think they can be a device for forcing changes in the domestic laws of countries in the region. I think we've got to recognise, sadly, taking into account Australian standards, that they reflect something about the culture of some of these societies. Nonetheless, we'll continue to engage with neighbours about these matters, as we have around the world with countries that have got repressive homophobic laws. In some cases, particularly dealing with the African jurisdictions, you've got to do so as advocacy organisations recognise very carefully, lest your attempt to alter domestic laws simply produce a backlash. But when it comes to the broader question, I think the capacity we've got on Manus and on Nauru is enough, with a bit of some stops and starts, to see an end to the business model that people smugglers are deploying and exploiting.
For those people who are caught up in Nauru and PNG, would you be open to offering some kind of exemption to those who claim to be persecuted on the basis of their sexuality for resettlement in Australia?
The danger, that's superficially attractive. The danger there is that everyone who wants to come to Australia would make that claim. So I can't offer any exception to the simple message we are sending to break the model of people smuggling. And that is, if you come by boat to Australia without a visa, you're going to end up being processed, and you're going to end up being resettled, if successful in that process, on Manus Island or elsewhere in PNG over time, and in Nauru. We've simply got to do that to end what is a scourge. Now, let me just say to everyone who had the same sentiment I had and Kevin Rudd had 10 years ago, when there were only a few hundred a year, we thought it was cruel of John Howard not to simply allow them to slide sideways into the Australian population mix. But you cannot do that when people smuggling has increased, and the number of displaced people in the world has increased to something like 40 million. And this exploitation is growing exponentially. If it can be 20% of the Australian migrant intake this year, what will it grow to next year if not stopped? And it can really be pitched as a humanitarian case. We cannot allow this to go on because of the number of lives lost at sea. And the only way to do it, I just say to people who, for the best of motives, criticise what the government's doing here, please think about the fact that this is now an issue of people smuggling, and second, please nominate an alternative to what we're doing, and then the debate can move to a different plane.
Indeed. All right, Bob Carr, we'll have to leave it there for this evening, but thank you very much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to join the discussion about Australian public policy, visit OurSay.org. And as always, for the latest political news throughout the day, visit our website at abc.net.au/news. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Thanks for joining us.